Good Tuesday night, and thank you very much for joining us. I am Thabo Mdluli. The EFF lawyers have rejected President Cyril Ramaphosa's argument that his campaign records are private and should remain sealed. The bank statements relating to Ramaphosa's 2017 ANC presidential bid are at the center of the court case. The EFF's legal team insists the party wants the records to see whether there was any corruption relating to the fundraising drive.
We know that which was sealed includes the banking details where the various individuals had made donations to the CR17 campaign. Now, we are told that the CR17 campaign had whatever purposes it had, but including in it was to advance the political journey of the president together with members of the African National Congress in their 54th National Conference. I must stop here to make the following submission. Your Lordship would hear that the reasons why the lifting of the seal is being resisted, amongst others, is that what was happening in that 54th National Conference of the African National Congress is a matter private and internal to a political party. Well, we want to make the submission that that standpoint is in law and in fact there. And we fortify our submission by directing your Lordship to how political office is assumed under our constitutional architecture and under our law. The argument which is sponsored on behalf of the President that says we are conflating what is a private run by a private party in its own private space doing its own elections is a matter that has nothing to do with the discourse of governance in this country. We are saying no. It is very plain that whatever they do in their party, it is not possible if it does not yield to comport quite properly as it is required to do with the Electoral Act.
Asaminya maintains that under the assumption that the ANC president will become the head of state, the financial records are in the public interest.
So we are meeting that argument and saying the CR17 campaign, when it went to seek donations to accelerate, amongst others, the election of the then Deputy President to the position 1 of the ANC, it did that understanding that if successful, the President would ultimately assume the position of President of this country in terms of the electoral law. We make the next submission that once we know that the assumption of office is only possible through that route, it then begins to explain that when the public protector was enjoined to investigate the complaints, she then went and looked at exactly what it is that was donated into the CR17 campaign. And it is that information which is then kept under the seal by the directive of the Deputy Judge President, and it is that which, in terms of this application, we're saying it cannot be done.
Well, it's been a trending story of the day, the CR17 bank statements. I don't have to tell you about that, but tonight I would like to get your views on that. Does the issue raised by the fundraising committee of the CR17 campaign on behalf of its donors of the right to privacy trump that of the public interest in knowing who funded the current president of the country, President Cyril Ramaphosa? That is where we are shining the spotlight tonight. And joining me in that conversation, Professor at Wits Business School, Yane Rousseau, Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism Advocacy Coordinator Chris Takur, as well as UCT Public Law Associate Professor Richard Calland. Right to, okay, a little bit later on, maybe we'll be joined by more guests, but let's deal with these three for now, and then we will, of course, unpack more as we continue. Do give us your thoughts at Newsroom 405. WhatsApp us your questions and your comments on 072-110-5584. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. And I'll start with you, Richard, and that is really the fundamental question we are asking tonight. Does the right of privacy apply here as far as the funders of political individuals? Now, the argument is this is a private organization involved in a private election. But what is clear, though, is that we know that that private process is going to end up giving us an individual who will be in the public space. So do we have a right to know who funds him?
So, Thabo, thank you. This is a very, very important topic, and I'm very glad you decided to cover it, and with a range of guests and voices, I hope. It's a debate, though, I think, for the future, not the past. And so whilst I understand that the CR17 campaign, as it's known, is a topic of great interest and has a lot of politics around it, which no doubt we'll touch on, the debate really has to be about what future governance arrangements should govern such contributions to such funds, such campaigns. Because to retrospectively refit, as it were, retrofit the arrangements that applied back in 2017 would be extremely unjust on all people concerned. So I think that's a sterile debate. And the short answer to your question is yes. I think that privacy considerations do apply because there was no other rule which said that there should be transparency in relation to those donations and those campaign contributions at that time. In other words, at that time, there was no rule requiring the donors or the recipients, Mr. Ramaphosa, from disclosing the identity and the amounts involved.
Now, Caris, do you agree with that? I mean, that's the end of it. There was no rule at the time requiring the president. There was, even under the Executive Ethics Code, the argument today was heard for president to disclose that kind of information. And so, well, it wasn't required in the past. Yes, it is required now. So that's what we'll look to do in the future.
Yes, well, Thabo, so Amabungane's position in relation to this issue is that we are not wading into the merits of this specific matter. So in relation to the broader CR17 matter and the public protector, we don't take a view about whether either of them acted unlawfully. And in relation to these documents forming the subject of today's court hearing, we don't take a view as well about whether or not they should specifically be disclosed. Our concern relates to the application of principle. So today, in this case, we were arguing about, our counsel made submissions in relation to the principle of open justice. And privacy is one aspect that has to be brought into the balancing exercise that needs to be taken into, that needs to be applied when making the decision whether or not to unseal these records. So that is our position in relation to today's matter. And then when it comes to the disclosure of these interests, our arguments in the CR17 matter that was heard in the Constitutional Court in November is that the constitutionally, the Executive Ethics Members Code needs to, constitutionally it's required to provide for such disclosures of internal campaign financing. And to the extent that it doesn't, our argument is that that code is unconstitutional. Because taking into account a number of provisions in the Constitution, it must be that this type of internal campaign financing should be disclosed. But our argument here applies to the interpretation of the code and not necessarily retrospectively.
All right, we'll continue in a moment on this conversation with my panel tonight, Yanni Rousseau, Chris Takur, as well as Richard Calland. We'll get your views as well and your thoughts on this in a moment at Newsroom 405. Also on WhatsApp, and your comments coming through there on 072-110-5584. Stay with us. The Newsfeed Late Night continues for you in a moment. Welcome back. The Newsfeed Late Night continues now in conversation on the whole issue of transparency, accountability and openness when it comes to private funders of those who hold public office. The question is how private money should be handled in as far as being open and transparent, and how much a role does it really play in influencing public life. In that conversation with us tonight, Professor Yanni Rousseau, Chris Takur, as well as Richard Calland. We are now also joined by Khalib Gallant, who is the Deputy National Coordinator for Right to Know. To join us in the conversation, you can tag us at Newsroom 405, WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Professor Rousseau, let me bring you in here. How much does private money influence our public life? And therefore, are we in agreement that the current new party funding law that is in operation is rational?
Yes, I'm always in favor, Tabu, of more transparency rather than less transparency. I'm in favor of the disclosure of party funding. Understand the argument about campaigns for presidents going forward vis-à-vis the past. However, my argument is that if the CR17 campaign funding is published, we should use the same energy to get the Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma funding in the 2017 election published. And then we might just as well go back all the way to a democratic South Africa and publish all the funding. And personally, I would be very interested to see the funding of Mr. Jacob Zuma. Was it back in 2007 when the current leader of the EFF was still willing to kill for Mr. Zuma, and Mr. Zuma was elected as president of the ANC. I would love to see the funding of that campaign. So if we want to open one of these funding incidents like the CR17, let's open all of them. Then we have a level playing field.
Yeah. So, I mean, the argument is, well, President Cyril Ramaphosa is the current head of state. The people that you're mentioning are not in the seat of the president. He's in the hot seat and therefore should exercise the highest degree of transparency and lead by example, especially considering that the CR17 campaign funds, which he has already admitted, were also used to pay at least 2 of the applicants' members of parliament.
Well, in short, in 2007, Mr. Zuma became ANC president, so therefore the same argument applies, and all other candidates who were elected. The other argument, of course, is that in terms of the CR17 campaign, Mr. Ramaphosa had no automatic assumption that he would be the successful candidate in raising funds for such a campaign. Hence my argument, you open one, you open all of them, successful and unsuccessful candidates.
Khalib, if an organization like the JSE could not keep its deliberations secret, why would we be okay with a political party and its campaign details being kept secret?
So, good evening. I think one of the difficulties that I'm having with the court case and how it's been, I guess, prosecuted is I guess the legal framework. We've just had the Political Party Funding Act enacted, and that does allow for an opening, some look into political party funding, but primarily for the work that political parties do on the national, provincial, and local government stage. So it's their external work when they are contesting as political parties. And because that's a public space, there clearly is a big public interest in that. That, I think, is the rationale behind how the Act has been crafted. during deliberations, we did push for openness around all political party dealings. So internal election processes also are political activities. But I think the legislature balked at that particular piece. So in terms of the legal position at the moment, political parties have to be more transparent about their public political activities. The challenge we're sitting with now with the CR17 campaign is that that's an internal campaign. The reality also is that probably most of our political parties aren't the most democratic internal spaces. So, and that's, I think, the reality. So the political horse trading that happens internally to get into the top 6 or the president's role or whatever your leadership structure is within the political party isn't necessarily a democratic principle, a democratic process as we want to hold in terms of the country. Now, as a private entity, does the ANC have the right to be as undemocratic internally as possible? You know, that's up to it. The challenge would be that I think the aspect for me that's the most problematic is the lawfare. So we're using the legal system to fight political battles, and that's always a murky territory. So to the extent that political parties are private entities, should they be beholden to their internal membership is maybe the question. Yeah. As a civil society activist, of course, we want openness and transparency. But what is the interest of me, Joe Public, in the internal machinations of the ANC or the DA or the EFF?
Well, certainly, Khalib, I mean, as you mentioned it, and Richard, I'm going to bring you back in here, but Khalib, first, I want you to take a bite at it. You've already mentioned that in the political arena, certainly the ongoing rhetoric around the sealing of the bank statement has gained a whole lot of currency. So, from the right to know perspective, what do you think are the real objectives that are unstated behind this call to have the bank statements unsealed?
So I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the political game that is being played and the internal factionalism. So even as the professor said, there's calls now for CR17 bank statements to be unsealed, but no concomitant call for his competitor at the time, her bank records to be unsealed. And that speaks to a lack of even-handedness. One of the arguments that has been made is that as the president of the ANC, you've ascended to the most powerful position in the country, as president of the country then, but that could have applied to either of them. Also, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma has in fact ascended as a minister, as the COGTA minister, to arguably, under COVID-19 conditions, the second most powerful cabinet minister in the country anyway. So if we are trying to join those political dots, right, then tackling only one, not the other, raises suspicions in my mind about what the motivation for that is.
Richard, we're going to have an uphill battle trying to prove that the motives of the EFF have nothing to do with fostering accountability or transparency, because this is what they're saying. This is the only reason we're asking for those documents to be unsealed.
Well, that's right. And Khalid makes a very important point that one needs to be even-handed in this. And that's not apparent in the current case. The current case, it would seem, has a very, very clear political motive. And indeed, as you'll know from newspaper reports, it would seem from earlier litigation that the EFF has in any case had sight of these bank records. They know what's there. I think it's a fake news campaign. It's really about undermining the president. It's about buttressing the RET narrative around white monopoly capital. It's about bringing back the Bell Pottinger crafted message. And it's really about who succeeds Ramaphosa in next year, 2022, with the next ANC election. So that's the real motive here. And we have to be very careful, I think, to disentangle the law and the governance issues, the matters of principle that my colleagues have been seeking to raise, from the hardcore politics of it. And it's not easy to disentangle those, but that's our job, I think. And our job is to help the public understand that there's two things going on here. There is a very important debate, as I said earlier, about what I think should be a future set of rules to regulate internal donations, because that's what it is. And the new act, which comes into force on the 1st of April, is really focused on donations to political parties, not to individual candidates for internal party races. My own view, and I think colleagues here agree with me, is that in future at least, those campaign donations for internal campaigns should be made public, because the winner may well end up in executive office. And if a big company has contributed to his or her success, they may well then call in that favor later, and the public has a right to know. That's the joining the dots process here. But that has to be prospective, not retrospective. That's a very important principle of law, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, in the context of this debate gaining political currency, maybe the legal issues are still being debated, and we'll soon know how they pan out. But in the political space, there are those then who are saying, well, by keeping the donors a secret, by preventing the disclosure of the full record, it is reasonable for the public to then hold a perception that the president has got something to hide.
Well, I think one way of testing that proposition, Taba, and I think you're asking the right questions as usual, would be to ask how Ace Magashule, for example, feels about this issue. Is he willing to disclose people who are funding him right now? Because there is plenty of anecdotal evidence swirling around that suggests that he is now on a fundraising campaign for himself and his own campaign and his own faction within the ANC. That's forward-looking. That's where we should be devoting our attention now. And if the RET folks and the EFF are serious about this, if it really is a matter of principle for them, rather than trying to simply damage this particular president for short-term gain, then they should be supporting that exercise of principle to say that in future donations made to individuals like Ace Magashule, who may well be trying to circumnavigate and get around the new provisions that will come into force on the 1st of April, that's where attention should really be focused for the future, I believe.
Well, I mean, Khalib, one might argue that what Richard is raising is whataboutism, because we are just getting into that space. Well, say if we're asking this one to disclose, what about that one? And it's not helpful. We should be, of course, asking the president to disclose. And yes, we should be asking the Secretary General to disclose as well. But right now, the focus is on the president and him disclosing.
But perhaps we need to take a step back, right? If you are asking, it's perfectly legitimate to ask the president, but on the basis of what? And the basis for some of this, at least, is a now discredited public protector report into the CR17 campaign. The courts have ruled that that particular report from her was lacking in legal substance and in fact. And so one has to, again, not forget that. Of course, she's appealing it. But some of the allegations that she's made around money laundering, etc., really feed into a narrative that raises suspicion, but not necessarily tied into fact. And so I think we have to be very careful about that. At the very least, there needs to be prima facie evidence. So that's what this whole joining the dots is about, and what was argued in court earlier today. That, in fact, the EFF lawyers were arguing, well, there's nothing untoward with these, with the donations. We're not arguing that. We're looking for openness and transparency. And so, for what reason? And if you go down that road, and you say, well, okay, it only applies to one person and not everybody else, then we're dealing with not whataboutism, but I think we're dealing with a very pointed strategy directed at a particular individual. I'm not in the business of wanting to protect any of our political leaders. and the stench of corruption and capture is one that is rank in the country at the moment. And so we must do as much as possible to shine the light of openness and transparency into these dark spaces. But, however, I think the caveat has to be that there has to be some basis for doing so. And so in that 2017, in the run-up to 2017, some of the donors to the Dlamini Zuma campaign were some very dodgy individuals. That's also in public knowledge, you know, cigarette vendors and yet that's not being that's not part of the discussion and the debate. So
all right, let's just hold it there and take a break. We'll come back and tease that a little bit further. Yanni Rousseau, Chris Taku, Richard Calland, and Khalid Garland with us tonight. We're coming to you on Twitter as well, and your WhatsApp questions and comments on 072-110-5584. We're back in a moment. All right, welcome back. You're with the Newsfeed Late Night conversation tonight about the right to privacy and public interest in the disclosure of the CR17 campaign funding. Yanni Rousseau, Karis Takur, Richard Calland, and Khalid Garland with us tonight. Let's go to WhatsApp and see what your questions and comments are tonight. This one is from Kulegani Kuzwa in Rosebank saying, there's nothing private about funding a political party seeking to ascend to the highest office of the land. Bank statements of the CR17 campaign must be disclosed to the public and end the cloud over the current leadership. Justice Mwepe saying no one has the right to disclose my private funding, my private fundraising. However, in this case, where transparency is required by society, why is it difficult to disclose the CR17 fundraising campaign? Who funded the CR17 campaign? From Mandla in Midrand, the fair way to deal with matters is that all those leaders of political parties should also disclose their funders because President Ramaphosa was not the only person contesting. Others as well should also come clean. Those are the issues being ventilated tonight on WhatsApp, but also suppose they're coming from our panel as well tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Nights. Chris, this issue of the public protector, no, you're saying your interest in particular is about open justice. The issue of the public protector's report having been successfully challenged by the president in our courts of law, is that reason enough that a part of this court record be kept sealed?
Thabo, I think that's specifically what we said. We are not weighing in on that point, and I think that's why we just need to be clear about Amabungane's intervention in the main case and here was purely on points of principle. So any views we may have about that is not relevant because we don't want to detract from this issue of openness and transparency. And from what you were just reading these WhatsApp comments, I think it's clear that there's a real need. The public are crying for this transparency in relation to these internal donations, which is not to suggest that there's anything inherently wrong with donating to a political party or a political campaign. But what the public needs to know is who's making these donations, and then the public must be free to draw their own conclusions about whether there's something untoward from that. So that is where we're coming in on this case. We're not going to weigh in on the public protector.
So, I mean, as a principle, I'm saying you're saying even though not in particular to these individuals, a case can be successfully challenged in a court of law, it is still in the public interest for those records to be made public so that the public can draw its own conclusion whether it agrees with the outcome or not.
Yes, so what we say is that there needs to be the default position, which is where the court is called upon to or is asked to pull a veil of secrecy over documents that form part of a court record. What we're saying is that it needs to apply this balancing act, and the lawfulness of the report in this case is one issue, but what we think should be the overriding concern is whether the disclosure will result in some kind of danger. And so in addition to that, whether that danger eventuating outweighs the public's benefit in that information being disclosed. So we're trying to establish the default position of openness, but then with the caveat that there may be extraordinary circumstances. So what those may be, we think should be left to the determination of the court. And so that's just, putting the issues on the one side of the scale and the public's interest in knowing the information on the other side and making that determination.
Professor Rousseau, does the fact that the Public Protector's report in this particular instance was successfully challenged in the High Court, we know that the appeal process is still pending at the Constitutional Court, but does the fact that the President was successful in challenging that report mean that we should then forget about it and turn the other way and not be interested in knowing?
Well, the Public Protector is fairly discredited by now. Many reports of the current Public Protector have been successfully challenged. It's really a long list. So to argue this on a report of the Public Protector for me is a slippery slope. I am in favor of more transparency rather than less transparency. I'll give you a few examples. I'm in favor of all government contracts being published for public scrutiny. For one, I'm in favor of the tax records of all cabinet ministers be published for public scrutiny every year. So I believe in public scrutiny, but then it must be true for everybody. If the CR17 campaign funding is published, I want to see the NDZ, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma campaign funding published. And I would be particularly interested in seeing the 2007 campaign funding of then Mr. later President, now former President Zuma, the campaign funding that made him the president of the ANC in 2007. I would be particularly interested in seeing that published. So you either publish everything or you publish nothing. Yeah. But by going for selective...
Why, Prof, would you say you would be particularly interested in knowing that detail?
Because that was when Mr. Julius Malema, who is now the leader of the ANC, was a staunch supporter of Mr. Zuma. So I'd like to see the role, for instance, from publication, whether or whatever we can see from publication, role Mr. Malema played in supporting Mr. Zuma. And after all, Mr. Zuma is the last president that came through such a process to election before Mr. Ramaphosa. Yeah. So therefore, I would be particularly interested in seeing it for a former president so that we can compare the two.
But then one would say, but the professor is now playing political games himself. He's not really dealing with the principle of the matter. Why are you getting into the realm and the space of the politics of the country?
It's not politics. It's either publish everything or publish nothing. For me, that is the position.
Khalib, let's talk then a little bit about public interest in broad terms as far as private money and how private money exposes us to greater risk of corruption. Should we not be saying, well, private money completely should not play part in individuals who are standing for office?
So this was a really important theme in the Political Party Funding Act now deliberations for more than 2 years. And with lots and lots of inputs about the need for public monies, private monies rather, to fund political campaigns. Argument was made by multiple people that running a political party is an expensive business, and so you can't just rely on the public fiscus. However, the challenges of whoever pays the piper calls the tune, and the influence that private money, and particularly the deep pockets of corporate interests, particularly how that can sway political decisions, both at a political level and at administrative level. So issues around capture. So that was the big thing. I think we reached a compromise with the act that there were certain limits. So any donation cumulative over 100,000 rand in any one year, some piercing of a corporate veil to see that you're not splitting up entities and it's really one entity behind it. I mean, we put some checks and balances in it. I think we're sitting with the reality where private money will be funding political activities for a while still. We're not at a place where political activity can be funded by the fiscus, which we do have in some jurisdictions, and with the caps, etc., that we see there. Everyone is afraid of the specter of state capture. And that capture has existed even before 1994. This relationship between moneyed interests and political power. And so it's part of our history, and one that through efforts like Amabungani's court application and other civil society activities, hopefully we can move to a place where that's less and less influential over time.
All right, Richard, take a bite at this. The idea that without knowing the identities of private money exposes us to greater risk of corruption. You're muted at this point. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
All right.
Is that if you're asking me to agree with that proposition, then the simple answer is yes. I've been advancing that argument since 1999, in the last century, when with the arms deal, it became apparent that secret, dodgy donations to the ANC had played a role in the procurement process in that arms deal scandal. And that led then to the Adasa case in 2005. The High Court in the Western Cape said, well, political parties are private creatures, so you have to prove that you need the information relating to party donations to protect another right. And at Adasa, we failed on that point. We chose not to appeal because the Secretary General of the ANC, Kgalema Motlanthe, said, we'll change the law in Parliament. And of course, he was right. It just took another 10 or more years to do so. But we got there in the end, and it's a cause for celebration. Unfortunately, a lot of, how can I put it, muddy water has flowed under the bridge since then. And a great deal of harm has been done to our body politic. And state capture, I've got no doubt, the whole process of state capture is intimately and intertwined with donations to individuals and donations to political parties. And it's across the board, unfortunately. So the DA in the Western Cape, donations from property developers may well have played a significant role in some of the spatial planning development decisions of the DA government. We don't know. The point is that from the 1st of April, all of that changes. And whilst I'm sympathetic to Khalib's point about the relationship between private money and politics, the fact is political parties are expensive. They do need support. And the state is not... are we as taxpayers willing to pay for all of the costs of political parties? Probably not. Already the state, through the constitutional provision 236 and the Public Funding of Representative Political Parties Act, already gives some contribution to political parties, but clearly there's a gap in need. And what the new regime will do is ensure that there is at least transparency, so that the public can join the dots and interrogate the process and see whether an individual donation has had an influence on policy and on government. That's the key issue.
We've accepted this fact that to run a political party is expensive, right? But we've never interrogated what makes it so expensive. What exactly are they paying for, right? Because you've got other political parties who say, well, we've run a campaign with only 2 million, and that was enough. Right? The smaller parties, I suppose. Then you've got bigger ones. And we have to ask the question, is it necessary for them to amount to hundreds of millions of rands?
Well, that's a very interesting question. In a sense, this is, again, this double kind of persona that political parties have. On the one hand, legally, they are private clubs, so they can kind of do what they like within the law. On the other hand, they play a public function. And the court has on a number of occasions said that public function means that public law and the Constitution can interact with their rules and interfere with them and intervene. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition. When it comes to campaigning, therefore, it's very hard for us to kind of tell political parties what they should and shouldn't do. After all, they are creatures of a competitive political system. They want to compete for votes, and how they choose to market themselves has to be their choice. It's a matter of freedom of expression and free speech. So I'd be very reluctant to limit that. But on the other hand, a lot of money is wasted on posters. That's the personal view. I would like to see a lot more money spent on policy making, on building up the capacity of political parties to think, to interact with the public in a more meaningful fashion. That would be a much better investment in money. But unfortunately, posters, T-shirts, and the rest of it, the paraphernalia of electoral politics tends to be the dominant feature of much of the campaigning in this country, and it absorbs a great deal of money. Plus, it is, Talbot, it's a big country. That sounds facetious, but it is a big country. It's a complex electoral market. And to get around the place and to campaign effectively in this country, you do need resources.
Yanni Rousseau, Chris Taku, Richard Calland, and Khalib Garland with me tonight. We're back with you on the Newsfeed Late Night. We'll wrap up this conversation in a moment. Welcome back with us here on the Newsfeed Late Night, and we continue with our conversation tonight on the openness, transparency and accountability when it comes to the funding of private individuals in political parties. Yanni Rousseau, Chris Taku, Richard Calland, and Khalib Garland with us here tonight. Chris, so are you saying here we were failed by the executive code at this particular point that did not compel the president to disclose?
Absolutely, and that's why we think that constitutionally it should be interpreted, or constitutionally it requires that such disclosures should be made. And I think I definitely take the point of my fellow panelists that had this interpretation been applied and not resisted in the past, then we wouldn't be where we are at the moment, having these battles and seeing these political machinations play out using transparency as almost a political tool, when in fact it's a very important constitutional principle. And that it's unfortunate, but we think that, you know, if you take on board, and we would hope that the Constitutional Court takes our arguments on this very seriously, and if we can have that constitutional interpretation of this code to provide for this internal campaign financing disclosures, it will really open up the playing field. We'll be able to have a lot more honest, frank discussions about how money is moving within political parties. It closes a loophole in the Political Party Funding Act, which applies to political parties and not these internal candidates. So I think to the extent that we need, the public is crying out for this knowledge. This is where it needs to be, and so that's why we would argue that this code, needs to be interpreted in this way, and the Constitution demands that.
Yeah. Well, the courts did not accede to your plea on technical grounds, but does this mean it's the end of the road then from the Amabungane's point of view as far as this particular application is concerned?
So if it's that it's not in the code, it must be somewhere. Our view is that the Constitution requires this. So to the extent that it's not provided for in this code or elsewhere, it has to be. So we will continue our advocacy in relation to this issue, because it's an absolute dire need at this point. Definitely, we've seen the influence that money can have, and the benefit that it can, and to the extent that money confers a benefit on individual candidates, this is a matter of public interest. That's what it boils down to. And so we will continue advocating for this transparency in the public interest.
All right. Let's look at other issues here that are raised in this particular argument, Khalib. The question of the reason being given for the sealing of the documents, right? However we think about the process and the politics thereof, but the lawyers are arguing that confidentiality is not reason enough to say the bank statements must be sealed. What is your view? Okay, you're also muted now. You can unmute for us. Thank you.
Sorry.
All right.
The different parties obviously were arguing from respective perspectives. with the FICA Center, for example, arguing its legal obligations. The question around confidentiality of bank statements, again, there's a strange net of legislation that relates to financial transactions anyway. So trying to untangle all of that is very problematic. If we look, though, at what is in the public interest, which is the spending of the money, who gives money and on what is it being spent, that's surely in the public interest. Or for the CR17 campaign, in the interest of the 1 million or so ANC members. Because the decision that the ANC members were making was about who their president would be. And so I guess there would be the interest in that. Keeping those donations, the internal donations, confidential, at least deprives ANC members of making an informed vote. The bigger problem facing the country, though, is the influence peddling and the selling of influence, particularly of the leadership in the political parties. And so that happens at every single level. And I do think that there's a public interest in perhaps setting aside confidentiality, as we have in the Act now, to a certain extent, that it can be set aside. You can redact the information in the way of disclosing information, also proactively, in a way that still protects privacy and takes privacy concerns into account. So there are ways around that. I don't think confidentiality should be an absolute bar to openness and transparency.
Richard, the essence of the matter is, I mean, the application has been brought forward. Whether we agree with the merits of it or we don't, we are having this conversation now. The nation is having this conversation. If you look at the kind of interest that it has raised, it is in the public interest that those documents be out there. I mean, would you agree that essentially that's what it means?
I'm afraid I don't agree with that. Which may be surprising as a long-term advocate for transparency in this area, as someone who strongly believes that financial donations to political parties and to political leaders should be open to public scrutiny. And the reason is the one I've already said, which is the very important legal principle of retrospectivity, which means you shouldn't make laws that apply backwards, because then the situation at the time that is under scrutiny, different rules, different laws applied. And I think that Khalib again has touched on an important point. This is very significant for the country, of course. If a candidate within the ANC, in particular, because it's the majority party, succeeds in winning political power in the ANC and goes on to become president and enters the presidency with kind of debts owed to people who have funded his or her campaign. That's a very important point of principle. And governance rules need, as Cerise has argued very compellingly, need one way or another to fix that lacuna. It's very, very important for the future, but not the past. And as for the current political furore around this, it's clear that it's been fanned, and the motive behind it is short-term political goals. It's designed to damage this particular president. We should recognize that for what it is. It's a campaign of misinformation. It's designed to propagate a particular narrative around this particular politician.
Does the narrative continue to weaken him politically within the party and elsewhere?
No, I think it bounces off him. I think that most people who have had experience in politics, especially within the ANC, understand exactly what is going on here. But the point I was still trying to get to was that it's really for the ANC to fix this. If they're serious about it, they must fix their own house. They must save for next year,
right,
2022, which is going to be an extremely important year for the ANC.
We're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Let me thank you very much all for joining us. Professor at Wits Business School, Yanni Rousseau, Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism Advocacy Coordinator, Sharice Takur, and UCT Public Law Associate Professor Richard Calland, as well as Right to Know Deputy National Coordinator, Khalib Gallant. All right.